The Department of Veterans Affairs investigators arrived at Harbor Point on a gray Thursday morning. The facility director went pale when she saw the federal badges. By Friday, the medical director had resigned. By Monday, 3 nurses were suspended pending criminal investigation. By the end of the week, the corporate office had shut down medication protocols at 4 facilities in 3 states. And it all started because of 7 words that Commander James Harris wasn't supposed to hear. Commander Harris's daughter approved the increased sedatives. She said, whatever keeps him quiet is fine. She's tired of the paranoid Navy stories anyway. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like the video for your support. Thank you for subscribing. Commander James Harris woke at 05:30 hours as he had every morning for 60 years. The habit was carved deeper than bone. Submarine service didn't allow for sleeping in, and retirement hadn't changed his internal clock. The room was dark, the curtains drawn against the Atlantic dawn breaking over the Massachusetts coast. He could hear the ocean from here, 3 blocks away, the rhythmic pulse that had been the soundtrack to 32 years of his life. The room smelled like industrial cleaner with an undertone of something medicinal he couldn't quite identify. Antiseptic, maybe, or the chemical residue of whatever they mopped the floors with. It reminded him of sick bay on the USS Nautilus, that same institutional attempt to mask human biology with synthetic scents. He pushed himself upright slowly. At 81, every movement required deliberate effort. His back ached. Legacy of decades hunched over sonar displays and navigation charts in spaces never designed for men over 5'9". His hands were steady, though. That was important. Steady hands had kept him alive beneath the Arctic ice during the Cold War, had helped him guide nuclear submarines through waters where one mistake meant international incident or worse. The dresser held few personal items. A photograph of Margaret on their wedding day in 1968, her smile bright against the background of the base chapel. Next to it, a model of the USS Thresher, his first boat, lost with all hands in 1963, 2 years before he'd reported aboard. He kept it as a reminder that the ocean didn't care about your rank or your intentions. A shadow box held his service ribbons and dolphins, the submarine warfare insignia that meant more to him than any of his commendations. Commander James Harris, Jim to Margaret, always commander to everyone else, had been at Harbor Point Veterans Care Facility for 11 months. The decision hadn't been his. After Margaret's death 14 months ago, he'd tried to maintain their house in Portsmouth, the one with the view of the harbor where he could watch the boats come and go. But Sarah, his daughter, had other ideas. "Dad, you can't live alone anymore," she'd said, her voice tight with exasperation during one of her increasingly rare visits from California. "You forgot to pay the electric bill twice. You called me at 3 a.m. last week thinking it was noon. You need professional care." He'd tried to explain about the bills. They'd changed the online system, made it deliberately confusing. And the phone call had been a miscalculation in time zones, not confusion about what time it was in New Hampshire. But Sarah had already made up her mind. She'd found Harbor Point online, arranged everything remotely, set up the trust that would pay for his care from his retirement savings and VA benefits. "It's perfect, Dad. Right on the coast, specifically for Navy veterans. You'll be with your people." Except they weren't his people. The few other veterans here were Army or Air Force, and most were too far gone with dementia or medication to hold a meaningful conversation. The staff called everyone by their first names with forced cheerfulness, erasing rank and service and everything that had defined their identities. The recreational activities were bingo and old movies, not the kind of mental engagement he needed to keep his mind sharp. But Jim had adapted. It was what submariners did, adapt to confined spaces, limited resources, challenging conditions. You ran silent, ran deep, and completed your mission. The morning routine was invariable. Shower at 05:45. The water pressure was weak but adequate. Dress by 0600, khaki pants, navy blue polo shirt, the civilian uniform he'd adopted in retirement. Breakfast cart arrived at 07:55. Today it was Denise with the tray. She was one of the regular nursing assistants, mid-30s, usually professional, if distant. "Morning, Commander," she said, using his rank, because he'd insisted on it during his first week. Most of the staff had given up and called him Jim anyway, but Denise remembered. "Morning," he replied, His voice was still strong, the command voice that had carried through steel corridors and over the noise of nuclear reactors. The tray held oatmeal, whole wheat toast, orange juice, coffee, and the small paper cup of pills. Jim looked at the pills with the same careful attention he'd given to every instrument reading on the boat. 3 pills. There should have been 2, the blood pressure medication and the low-dose aspirin his cardiologist had prescribed. "What's the third one?" he asked. Denise glanced at the cup. "I'd have to check your chart, Commander. Probably something the doctor added at your last visit." "I haven't seen the doctor in 6 weeks." "Well, I'm sure it's been approved. You want your coffee while it's hot?" She left before he could ask more questions. Jim picked up the third pill, small, round, white, no markings visible. He set it aside and took only the 2 he recognized. The oatmeal was underseasoned and gluey, but he ate it. Fuel was fuel, and you didn't run operations on an empty stomach. After breakfast, he made his way to the common room. The walk took longer than it should. His mobility had decreased noticeably over the past 2 months. That concerned him. He'd been doing physical therapy 3 times a week until recently, maintaining decent strength and balance. But lately, he felt heavier, slower, like he was moving through water instead of air. The common room had large windows overlooking a small courtyard. Jim chose the chair in the corner, the one with clear sightlines to both entry doors and the hallway beyond. Old habits. On a submarine, you always knew your exits, always positioned yourself where you could see what was coming. He'd been watching for 2 months now. Not obviously, that was the key. On a boat, especially during Cold War patrols, you learned to observe without appearing to observe. You noticed patterns, anomalies, things that didn't fit the baseline. You built the picture over time, piece by piece, until you understood what was really happening. Harbor Point ran on routines, like any ship. Shifts changed at 0700, 1500, and 2300. Medication rounds happened at 0730, 1200, 1730, and 2100. The administrator, Karen Patterson, arrived at 0830 and left by 1600. The medical director, Dr. Rashid, came Tuesdays and Thursdays, spent an hour in his office, rarely saw patients. But there were anomalies. Residents who'd been alert and conversational would suddenly become docile and confused. Room 12, Arthur Chen, former Army sergeant, had been teaching Jim to play Go 2 months ago. Sharp mind, good strategic thinker. Now, Arthur barely spoke, sat in the dining room staring at nothing, hands trembling. Room 8, Patricia Kowalski, former Air Force radar operator, had been organizing a complaint about the food quality. Vocal, persistent, gathering signatures. Then she'd fallen in her room, according to the incident report Jim had glimpsed when a nurse left a chart open. After the fall, Patricia started taking additional medications for anxiety and pain management. Now she was quiet, compliant, no more complaints. Room 15, Vernon Oates, Navy corpsman from Vietnam, had asked Jim about filing a grievance regarding missing personal items. 3 days later, Vernon was moved to the memory care wing with a sudden diagnosis of advancing dementia. Jim hadn't seen him since. Pattern recognition. That was submarine warfare, detecting the pattern beneath the noise. And Jim was detecting a pattern. At 10:30 hours, he heard voices from the medication room down the hall. The door was open about 4 inches. 2 voices, female. One was Denise. The other was Rebecca, the lead nurse on the day shift. Jim remained perfectly still in his chair, appearing to doze while actually listening, with the acute attention he'd developed, tracking Soviet submarines through passive sonar. Sound carried differently in institutional buildings than in water, but the principle was the same: filter out the irrelevant noise, focus on the signal. Increased Harris to 10 milligradorn twice daily, Rebecca was saying. Her voice had that casual tone people used when discussing routine matters. Doctor's orders, approved by the daughter. Isn't that pretty heavy for someone with no diagnosed anxiety disorder? Denise sounded uncertain. Commander Harris's daughter approved the increased sedatives. She said, "Whatever keeps him quiet is fine. She's tired of the paranoid Navy stories anyway." Rebecca laughed, short and dismissive. Plus, he's been asking too many questions about other residents' medications. Corporate wants everyone stable and manageable before the state inspection next month. What about side effects? He's been moving slower. That's kind of the point. Look, the daughter has medical power of attorney. She signs off on everything remotely. She never visits, never questions anything. The corporate protocol is clear. Difficult residents get stabilized. The doctor signs the orders, the family approves, we implement. Harris gets his meds with breakfast and dinner, whether he swallows them or not. If he refuses, we note patient non-compliant and adjust the delivery method. Jim's heart rate didn't change. His breathing remained even. His posture stayed relaxed, the appearance of an old man napping in the late morning sun. But his mind moved with the cold, tactical precision that had earned him his command. They were drugging him. Systematically, deliberately, with his daughter's approval. The unidentified third pill was a sedative, probably lorazepam or something similar, designed to keep him quiet and compliant. The increased dosage explained his declining mobility, his heavier feeling, the difficulty he'd been having concentrating lately. Sarah had approved it. Tired of the paranoid Navy stories. His daughter, who'd grown up hearing his sea stories, who'd been proud of his service once, had written him off as paranoid and authorized chemical restraint rather than engage with his concerns. And it wasn't just him. Rebecca had referenced a corporate protocol. Difficult residents get stabilized. Arthur, Patricia, Vernon, all of them had been alert, questioning, potentially problematic. All of them were now sedated into silence. The state inspection was coming. Harbor Point wanted everyone quietly manageable. No complaints, no questions. A facility full of elderly veterans too drugged to cause trouble. Jim remained in his chair for another 20 minutes, apparently dozing, actually thinking, planning. This was a mission now, and missions required careful preparation. First, evidence. He needed documentation, medication orders, approval records, the corporate protocol Rebecca had mentioned. That meant accessing files, probably digital ones given the facility's reliance on tablets and computer carts. Second, corroboration. He needed other witnesses, other families who might not know their relatives were being overmedicated, not for medical reasons, but for administrative convenience. That meant finding ways to communicate with the outside world without facility oversight. Third, legal authority. The VA had authority. An inspector general's office. The state had a long-term care ombudsman. The federal government took veteran abuse seriously, at least in theory. He needed to know who to contact and how to present the evidence compellingly. Fourth, operational security. If they realized he was onto them, they'd increase his medication, move him to the locked memory care unit, or find some other way to neutralize the threat he represented. He had to continue appearing compliant, confused, controllable, while actually gathering intelligence and preparing his case. Submarine tactics. Run silent, run deep. Present one picture on the surface while operating with completely different intentions below. At lunch, Jim ate his sandwich and took the pills without question. He palmed the third pill. The technique was simple, practiced, and disposed of it later in his room's toilet. He'd need to maintain the appearance of taking the medication while actually keeping his mind clear. Over the next 3 days, Jim executed his reconnaissance. He established a baseline, what was normal, what doors were locked, when staff were distracted, where the cameras were positioned. Harbor Point had security cameras in common areas and hallways, but not in resident rooms. That gave him privacy to plan. He befriended Eugene, the evening maintenance worker, a veteran himself. Army, Desert Storm. Eugene had access to all the rooms, all the locked doors. Jim helped him fix a jammed window one evening, got talking about service, found common ground. Eugene mentioned he had a smartphone, used it to watch baseball games during his breaks. My daughter thinks I'm too old for technology, Jim mentioned casually. Won't even get me a basic phone, says I'll just confuse myself. Eugene had looked uncomfortable. That's rough, Commander. My dad's the same way. Never wants to bother anyone. Lets people make decisions for him. Different generation, Jim agreed. We were taught not to complain. On the fourth night, Jim waited until Eugene was working in the corridor. He pressed his call button for something minor, needed help adjusting his window. While Eugene fixed it, Jim asked if he could borrow Eugene's phone, just for a minute, to look up information about a ship he'd served on. Trying to remember the details for something I'm writing down. Memory's not what it used to be. Eugene hesitated, then handed over the phone. Sure, Commander. Just, don't tell anyone I let you use it. We're not supposed to. Jim took the phone with hands that didn't tremble. He had perhaps 3 minutes. He opened the browser, navigated to the VA Inspector General's office, found the complaint hotline number, memorized it. Then he searched for Massachusetts Long-Term Care Ombudsman, memorized that number too. Found what I needed, he said, handing the phone back. Appreciate it, Eugene. No problem, Commander. Jim now had numbers. He needed a way to make the calls without facility staff intercepting. The resident phone in his room would show in the facility logs. But there was a payphone in the lobby, almost never used, probably forgotten about by most staff. The next afternoon, Jim made his way slowly to the lobby during the shift change confusion at 1500 hours. He had quarters in his pocket. He'd been saving them from his occasional cafeteria purchases. The payphone still worked, remarkably. He dialed the VA Inspector General hotline. A recording answered, asked him to leave a message. He kept it brief, factual. This is Commander James Harris, USN retired, calling from Harbor Point Veterans Care Facility in Massachusetts. I have evidence of systematic medication abuse, veterans being sedated for administrative convenience, not medical necessity. Corporate protocol, family approval obtained through misrepresentation. Request investigation, I can provide documentation. He left the facility's address, then hung up. Then he called the state ombudsman. This time, a person answered. Jim repeated his report, more detail. The woman on the line took notes, asked questions. Can you provide specific evidence, Mr. Harris? Commander, he corrected gently. And yes, ma'am, I can. But I need to do this carefully. They're medicating me without proper medical justification. If they realize I'm filing complaints, they'll increase my dosage or isolate me. I need to gather documentation first. Commander Harris, if you're in immediate danger, I'm not, ma'am. I know how to handle myself in hostile conditions. But I need time to build the case properly. She gave him a direct number, told him to call back when he had more evidence, and logged his initial complaint. Be careful, Commander. Always am, ma'am. Thank you. He returned to his room without incident. Phase 1 complete, authorities alerted, wheels in motion. But he needed hard evidence, not just his observations and one overheard conversation. That night, he couldn't sleep. The PTSD that had plagued him since his service flared, dreams of the thresher, of the crushing pressure at test depth, of the silence when communication stopped. He woke at U-230, disoriented, heart pounding. But even in the darkness, even with his demons circling, his mind was clear. That was the irony Sarah didn't understand. Yes, he had PTSD. Yes, he sometimes had nightmares. But his cognitive function was intact, his observational skills were still sharp, and his ability to plan complex operations under pressure hadn't diminished. His daughter saw an old man who woke up confused sometimes and concluded he needed to be medicated into docility. She didn't see the submarine commander who'd conducted operations in Soviet waters, who'd maintained absolute composure when depth charges bracketed his boat, who'd brought his crew home through situations that should have killed them all. Over the next week, Jim implemented his intelligence-gathering operation. He observed medication rounds with systematic attention, noting which residents received which. Pills, which staff administered them, what times and circumstances. He memorized names, dosages when he could see them, behavioral changes in residents before and after medication adjustments. He befriended Martha, the weekend receptionist, who liked to talk about her grandson in the Navy. He mentioned that his daughter had all his paperwork and he was trying to remember details about his medical history. Do you think I could see my file sometime? I won't be any trouble. Just curious about the dates. Martha hesitated. Files are confidential, Commander. Of course, I understand. Just thought since it's my own information. He let it trail off, disappointed but respectful. 2 days later, Martha pulled him aside. I can't let you take anything, but if you want to look at your file for a few minutes while I'm filing other things. She glanced around. Just between us. Appreciated, Martha. She brought him to the records room during a quiet Sunday afternoon. His file was thick, 11 months of daily logs, medication orders, incident reports. He had perhaps 10 minutes before she'd need to return it. Jim's eyes moved rapidly. trained by years of reading complex technical documentation under time pressure. He found the medication orders, dated 2 months ago, signed by Dr. Rashid, approved electronically by Sarah Harris, medical power of attorney. Lorazepam 5 mg, twice daily for increased anxiety and agitation. He'd never been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. The justification was fabricated. He flipped further, found similar orders for Arthur Chen, Patricia Kowalski, Vernon Oates, all recent, all for sedatives or antipsychotics, all citing behavioral concerns that Jim knew were exaggerated or invented, all approved by family members remotely, probably based on staff recommendations. He couldn't photograph anything, no phone, and too risky anyway. But he had the dates, the medication names, the doctors and nurses involved. He memorized everything relevant, his mind cataloging the information with the precision he'd used to remember sonar contact data and navigation coordinates. "Thank you, Martha," he said quietly when she returned. "Helps to understand what's been going on." "Of course, Commander. We all get confused about our care sometimes." He didn't correct her assumption that he'd been confused. Let them underestimate him. That was tactically advantageous. That evening, Sarah called. The facility phone in his room rang at 1840 hours, unusual timing for her. She typically called Sunday afternoons, if she called at all. "Hi, Dad, how are you?" Her voice was bright, determinedly cheerful. "Fine, Sarah. How are things in California?" "Busy, you know how it is." "Listen, the facility administrator called me. She said you've been asking questions about your medications." Here it was. They'd noticed his inquiries, alerted his daughter, preparing to shut him down. "Just trying to understand my treatment," Jim said carefully. "I've been feeling more tired. Lately, moving slower. Wanted to know if my medications might be causing side effects." "The doctors know what they're doing, Dad. If they prescribe something, it's because you need it." A slight edge now, impatience breaking through the cheerfulness. "The administrator said you've been refusing some doses?" "I took my blood pressure medication and aspirin every day," Jim said truthfully. "If there were additional medications, I didn't understand what they were for." "Dad, you have to trust the professionals. I can't keep getting calls every time you have questions about your care. I signed off on everything the doctor prescribed because that's what you need. You've been agitated, confused. I haven't been confused, Sarah. And the medications are helping you adjust. Just take what they give you, okay? I don't want to have to put you on the locked unit. The threat was explicit. Comply or be isolated." "I understand," Jim said quietly. "Good. I love you, Dad. I just want what's best for you." After she hung up, Jim sat in the darkness of his room. His daughter had just threatened to have him locked up for questioning his own medical care. She'd approved medications without visiting, without examining him, based entirely on staff recommendations from a facility that had financial incentive to keep residents sedated. Sarah wasn't malicious. She was busy, overwhelmed, managing her own life 3,000 miles away. It was easier to trust the professionals, to believe the narrative that her father was declining and needed chemical management. Easier than acknowledging that institutional care could be abusive, that profit-driven facilities might prioritize compliance over well-being. Easier than believing her father when he tried to tell her something was wrong. The next morning, Rebecca brought his medication personally, unusual since she typically supervised rather than delivered. "Commander Harris, I understand you've had some concerns about your treatment." Her smile was professional, utterly inflexible. "Your daughter has authorized us to ensure you're compliant with your medication regimen. If you continue to refuse, we'll need to consider alternative methods of administration." "I'll take my medication," Jim said. He accepted the cup, brought the pills to his mouth, made the swallowing motion. Rebecca watched carefully, then checked his mouth. Also unusual. Jim had anticipated this. The pills were under his tongue, held there until she left. He spat them out immediately after, flushed them. But the message was clear. They were escalating surveillance. His time was running short. That afternoon, Eugene stopped by his room, looking uncomfortable. "Commander, I need my phone to stay with me from now on. Got in trouble for leaving it lying around. Can't let anyone borrow it anymore." "Understood, Eugene. Appreciate your help before." Jim now had no easy communication with the outside world. He had made one call to the ombudsman, but that had been days ago, with minimal evidence. He needed to accelerate the operation. He waited until Wednesday evening, Dr. Rashid's day. The doctor kept files in his office, probably more detailed than the charts Martha had shown Jim. The office door locked, but Jim had watched Eugene use his master key. Eugene left his keys on his cart when he went into rooms to do repairs. At 2130 hours, Jim made his way slowly down the corridor during Eugene's shift. Eugene was in room 23, fixing a radiator. His cart sat in the hallway, keyring hanging from the side. Jim had done insertions into Soviet naval bases with less risk than this. But the principle was the same: timing, misdirection, controlled movement. He palmed the keys with one smooth motion, continued past as if heading to the common room. Eugene never looked up. Dr. Rashid's office was on the second floor, away from resident rooms. Jim took the stairs, slower than he'd like, but the elevator had cameras. The hallway was empty. Night shift focused on medication rounds elsewhere. The key worked. The office was small, cramped with files and medical texts. Jim had perhaps 5 minutes before Eugene noticed his keys missing. He found the filing cabinet, searched for his name. The file here was more detailed. Notes from Dr. Rashid about his prescriptions. One entry dated 2 months ago. Family requesting behavioral management. Patient asking questions about facility operations. Disturbing other residents with conspiracy theories. Recommend anxiolytic to reduce paranoia and improve compliance. Daughter approved lorazepam protocol via email. Signed consent forms electronically. There it was. Documented proof that he'd been prescribed sedatives not for a medical necessity, but to shut him up. Conspiracy theories. They'd pathologized his legitimate concerns. He found Arthur Chen's file. Similar notes. Patient organizing complaints about food quality. Recommend medication adjustment to improve mood and reduce agitation. Patricia Kowalski. Patient attempting to file grievances, displaying oppositional behavior towards staff. Increased medication needed for safety. Vernon Oates. Patient refusing medications, questioning treatment plan, transfer to memory care recommended with family approval. It was systematic. Residents who questioned anything were labeled as having behavioral problems, medicated into submission, and when medication didn't work, moved to locked units and diagnosed with dementia. Jim heard footsteps in the corridor. Eugene, probably, looking for his keys. No time for photos, no way to take the files. But he'd seen enough. He slipped out of the office, locked it behind him, hurried to the stairwell as quietly as possible. Halfway down, he heard Eugene coming up the other direction. Jim flattened himself against the wall in the shadow between floors. Old training, hide in plain sight if the lighting's wrong. Eugene passed, muttering about his keys, heading to the second floor. Jim continued down, reached his floor, hung the keys on Eugene's cart as he passed room 23. Eugene would find them there eventually, assume he'd left them himself. Back in his room, Jim sat on his bed with shaking hands. The trembling wasn't from the medication he'd been avoiding. It was adrenaline, age, the physical cost of operation he'd just run. His back ached, his legs felt weak. He was too old for field work, but he'd gotten the intelligence he needed. The next morning, Jim pressed his call button at 0900 hours. When Denise arrived, he said quietly, "I need to see the ombudsman. It's my legal right to speak with an advocate without facility interference." Denise looked startled. "I'll have to check with the administrator. The state long-term care ombudsman regulations don't require facility approval for resident requests," Jim said calmly. "I'm formally requesting advocate access. Please document this request in my file." An hour later, Karen Patterson arrived at his room, her expression tight with controlled anger. "Commander Harris, I understand you're making some concerning requests. I'm requesting my legal right to speak with an ombudsman advocate. Of course you can speak with anyone you'd like, but I'm concerned about these accusations you're making. Your daughter mentioned you've been having some paranoid thoughts. I'm not paranoid, Ms. Patterson. I'm observant. There's a difference. The doctor believes your anxiety has been increasing. The doctor prescribed medication to silence my legitimate concerns about this facility's practices. I've documented evidence of improper medication protocols, and I will be sharing that evidence with state investigators." Karen's jaw tightened. "Commander, I think we need to have you evaluated by a psychiatrist. Your daughter has expressed concerns about your mental state." "My mental state is fine. My observations are accurate. You're running a corporate protocol that sedates difficult residents to avoid complaints before state inspections. I've seen the files, I've documented the pattern, and I've already filed preliminary reports with the VA Inspector General and the State Ombudsman Office. The color drained from Karen's face. You've had no access to phones? I was a submarine commander for 32 years, Ms. Patterson. I know how to operate in hostile conditions with limited resources. Your security protocols have more holes than a Cold War Soviet listening post. She stared at him, calculating, then turned and left without another word. Jim knew what would come next. They'd try to move him, medicate him forcibly, or declare him incompetent. He had perhaps hours to get outside help. At 11:30 hours, there was a knock at his door, a woman in a business suit, mid-40s, carrying a briefcase. Commander Harris, I'm Sandra Bowman from the State Long-Term Care Ombudsman Office. You called our hotline last week? Jim nearly collapsed with relief. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for coming. She closed the door, pulled out a recording device. I'm here to take your formal statement. Your preliminary report raised serious red flags. We're initiating an immediate investigation, and I've contacted the VA Inspector General's office as well. They're sending their team. For the next 2 hours, Jim laid out everything he'd observed, everyone he'd documented, all the evidence he'd gathered. Sandra took notes, asked precise questions, confirmed details. This is extraordinary work, Commander, she said finally. Most residents in your situation wouldn't have the capacity or the resources to gather this kind of evidence. I had training, Jim said simply, and I had time. The VA investigators will be here tomorrow morning with a warrant for all medical records and staff documentation. In the meantime, you're under ombudsman protection. The facility cannot move you, change your medications, or restrict your access to outside communication without my office being notified immediately. Will this investigation expand to other facilities? Jim asked. The nurse mentioned corporate protocol. This isn't just Harbor Point. If the evidence supports it, yes, we'll pursue this wherever it goes. After Sandra left, Jim sat in his room and felt the weight of 60 years settle on his shoulders. He was exhausted, shaking, his body reminding him that he was 81 years old with a bad back and PTSD and no business running covert operations against institutional abuse. But he'd done it. He'd completed the mission. The VA investigators arrived the next morning with federal authority. They seized records, interviewed staff, examined medication logs and corporate policy documents. By afternoon, they'd suspended 3 nurses and placed Dr. Rashid on administrative leave. By evening, Harbor Point's corporate parent company had issued a statement about reviewing protocols and cooperating fully with investigators. The Boston Globe ran the story 3 days later. Federal investigation into veteran care facility reveals systematic medication abuse. The article mentioned Commander James Harris by name. His choice, despite Sandra's offer of anonymity. People need to know this happens, he'd told the reporter. And they need to know it can be fought, Sarah called finally. Her voice was shaking. Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I thought I was helping. They told me you were getting confused and aggressive. They lied to you, Sarah. They're good at it. I should have visited. I should have questioned more. I trusted them because I wanted it to be taken care of, because I'm so far away, because it was easier. I know, Jim said quietly. But now you do know, and you can do better. The investigation expanded. Harbor Point was one of 12 facilities in the corporate network. 8 of them had similar protocols: medicate difficult residents, maximize compliance, minimize complaints. Federal charges were filed against corporate officers. State licenses were suspended. Reforms were mandated. Jim moved to a different facility, a better one, smaller, genuinely focused on care rather than management. Sarah visited 3 times in the next month, more than she'd come in the previous year. They were working on their relationship, carefully, like people who'd forgotten how to talk to each other and were relearning the language. Other residents from Harbor Point contacted him, families who'd had no idea their relatives were being drugged inappropriately, veterans who'd felt voiceless and found someone who'd fought for them. Jim became an advocate, consulting with ombudsman offices, sharing his story, helping others recognize the signs of institutional abuse. On a morning in late autumn, Jim stood at the window of his new room and watched the ocean. A submarine was visible on the horizon, probably heading to Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, probably carrying a young crew who thought they were invincible, who didn't yet understand what the ocean could do. He'd been that young once. He'd believed that completing the mission was what mattered, that everything else was secondary to the objective. Margaret had taught him different, that people mattered, that relationships required attention, that heroism wasn't just about facing external enemies, but about showing up for the people you loved. He'd spent 32 years in service to his country. He'd spent 47 years married to a woman who'd understood him better than he understood himself. He'd spent 1 year being systematically drugged by people who saw him as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. And he'd spent 3 months fighting back with every skill he possessed, every ounce of tactical knowledge, every bit of stubborn refusal to be silenced that had kept him alive through decades of Cold War operations. Commander James Harris was 81 years old, living in a care facility because his body couldn't keep up with his mind. He had PTSD and chronic pain and memories that sometimes surfaced at 02:30 in the morning, pulling him back to boats that had sunk and men who died. But he also had dignity, voice, and the absolute certainty that he'd completed his final mission successfully. His hands were steady as he poured his morning coffee. The medication they gave him now was what he actually needed: blood pressure control, nothing more. His mind was clear. His purpose was renewed. Some things he'd learned you never really retired from: protecting people, speaking truth, refusing to be silenced. He raised his coffee cup toward the submarine on the horizon, a salute from one submariner to another, and allowed himself the rare luxury of satisfaction with a job well done.